Good morning, good Chaydesh, everybody. Rosh Chodesh El. We're going to start out on page 60. We're continuing on our conversation about the order of Kadima, of who comes first in giving tzedaka. Everybody has finite sums of money. What's the order? What's the proper order? How do we handle balancing different people's needs? So, on page 60, we quote the pasuk of Parashas Rei. We should all be very familiar with this. We learned it this past Shabbos. We even discussed it here between Mincha and Marav, Shabbos afternoon. If you have amongst you someone who is impoverished, from one of your brothers, in one of your gates, in your land, which Hashem gives you, don't harden your heart, don't clench your fist. So the Sifri, I believe Rashi quotes the Sifri. The Sifri says like this, that's your brother. Your brother comes first. Your brother comes first. It's interesting because it says that implies that a person could have two types of brothers, right? Because there's a particular one that's being singled out. How you could have two types of brothers? You could have a half brother from your father, and you could have a half brother from your mother. Obviously, you could have a full brother too. So a half brother from your father comes first. That's miyuchad. It's closer to an achacha, especially regarding inyane Yerusha. That's considered a closer relative. Ba'achad sharecha, in one of your gates, the inhabitants of your city comes first from inhabitants of other cities. Okay? However, be'artzecha, in your land, after you deal with inhabitants of your cities, before you worry about inhabitants of other cities, you have to worry about inhabitants of Eretz Yisrael. Be'artzecha, in your land. Eretz Yisrael. So it goes relatives, people in your city, Eretz Yisrael, people in other cities. And this is discussed in Halacha and Siman Reish Nun Aleph on page 61. Says the Mechaber, Hanosein Levanav Uvnosav HaGedolim, someone who gives money to his adult children, She'eno Chayev Mizonosem, he's no longer obligated to feed them. Now, the Shach says that means they're older than 6. We already discussed that that's not true today. Today, our chiyuvim of feeding our children extend past 6 years old. People are not going to work at a young age. It's a different system. And we said, based on Ramesh and others, that mitznoi ksuba, you have to feed your children, even if they're adults. But let's say a person has married children. Someone who gives money, financial gifts to his father, and they need it, that's considered tzedaka. They come before other people. Even if someone is not your father or your son, but it's a relative, you have to bring them before anybody else. And your brother from your father comes before your maternal brother. And the poor people and members of your household come before poor people in your city, and your city comes before poor people in other cities. Now, what's interesting here is the Shach Paskins, that poor people of your city have a kadima even over poor people in Eretz Yisrael. The Ramah says over here that a poor person in a city is called someone who his residence is in the city. Someone happens to come into the town for whatever reason, they're obviously not called a member of the city. The Mechaber continues, Yoshve Eretz Yisrael, people live in Eretz Yisrael, come before people live in Chutz Aretz, and Ramah makes a very important point, Parnosas Atzmo Kodem V'chol Adam. A person's own livelihood comes before anybody else. You're not obligated to give tzedakah, and if you remember, we discussed already, the Aruch HaShulchan says this is talking about meiser. It's not talking about, we'll discuss the Aruch HaShulchan. It's certainly not talking about the small amount of money, shlish shekel, everybody's chayav to give every year. But your own personal parnasa comes before the parnasa of anybody else. And it's interesting, the Ramah says that your relatives come before your neighbors. And your neighbors come before other people in the city. How you classify a neighbor, that's interesting. Okay. Now, the Pischei Tshuva over here has a very interesting thing. He says, based on the Chasam Sofer, people live in Yerushalayim, have a kadima, have a precedence over people in other cities in Eretz Yisrael. Now, we're not talking about that you should give tzedaka to someone in Yerushalayim over someone who's starving in Chutz La'aretz. That would be called dochen nefashos. You're not allowed to do that. So we're talking like this. If everybody is in the same situation, then Eretz Yisrael, Yerushalayim, comes before people in other cities. But let's say that the people in Yerushalayim have the bare minimum to sustain themselves. The way he expresses it is lechem tsar, bread. It may not be the tastiest bread, but you can live on bread and water. Then you first have to give other cities to sustain them before you run to give Yerushalayim to live like a mensch. It's interesting. He happens to write here that the minhag, in this same tshuva, he's discussing that the minhag in Eretz Yisrael was to go to Tzfas on Lag BaOmer and to make a big party there, and he wasn't happy with that idea. This is the Chasam Sofer talking. Okay, this is an interesting factoid. Has nothing really to do with our sugya. Okay. The halacha in Dalet on page 62, Reish and Aleph Dalet, is that Lamaisa, we don't really have this ability today, but when based in functioned and the norm had authority, Kofin ha'av lozon beno ani vafiluhu gadol. If a father is not giving tzedaka to his son and he has tzedaka to give, then we force a parent to give tzedaka to a child, even if that child is married, living in his own house with his own children. And we force him before we compel other poor people in the city. There is a concept that Beis Din can be kofa. We'll discuss this already about tzedaka. If Beis Din sees that there's indigent people and the poor people and the rich people are not giving as appropriate based on their assessment, Beis Din's assessment what these people should be giving, Beis Din can actually compel a wealthy person to give tzedakah. However, if the parent has the ability to give tzedakah, they get compelled first before anybody else. Now, the Aruch HaShulchan on page 64, it's worth reviewing. I believe we did this already, but let's discuss this. In the third line of the first where the gray is by the first column. This that we say that you're not chayav to give tzedakah until you could sustain yourself. Zeu b'tzedakah timidios ma'aser chomesh. As I mentioned, that's talking about ma'aser chomesh. Avalakayim mitzvah tzedakah, but to fulfill one of the 613 mitzvahs, the core fulfillment of tzedakah, a third of a shekel, mechuyav kol adam, everybody is responsible, even if it's someone who's completely impoverished, even if it's someone who himself or herself has to use funds of tzedakah to sustain themselves, nonetheless, I still have to give a shlosh shekel l'shana. Okay? Now, the problem is, how do you deal with this concept of kadima, of precedence? Because he says it's a well-known fact, shalachol asher yesh harbe krov maniyim. Baruch Hashem, Klal Yisrael is diverse, Klal Yisrael increases, and many wealthy people come from very large mishpachas. And presumably, based on averages, there'll be someone who's has not such great mazel with parnasa among their mishpacha. So, and let's say not an usher, let's say a regular person, Baruch Hashem, he makes enough for his own parnasa, he's able to give meiser, give valdik, but sof kol sof, that meiser presumably should go first to his relative, right? What about, so it's a problem, because if we follow the mitzvah of Kadima, it would come out that lo aleinu, poor people that don't have any relatives, Rahman al-San, but there are such people. Sometimes you have older poor people, right? Their relatives are no longer b'chayim, or something like that. They weren't zochet to children, whatever it is. So what, those people should starve to death? Because if we follow Kadima, all the Balabatim are going to give to their relatives, and Shalom Yisrael. That's irrational. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, ve'echav shalom aken. I mean, we can't possibly say this. So therefore, he wants to understand like this, that even after we have the Sifri, and even after we have it codified in Shulchan Aruch in in Reish Nun Aleph. Says the Aruch HaShulchan like this: Kol Balabayas, every Balabayas, Asher, a wealthy person. A Balabayas is someone who makes a decent salary, but he's not incredibly wealthy. Hanosein tzedaka, who gives tzedaka, mechuyav litain chelak la'aniyim harachokim, has to give a portion of tzedaka to poor people that are not related. When it says the concept of precedence, it's not saying all your money should go to your relatives. Elo de la krova of yitain yosar milasheno krova. Our Chashulchan understands the order of precedence as how you divide up your funds. Give more to your relatives than to non-relatives. But it's not understanding that the order of precedence is an exclusive, it's teaching you exclusiveness. Whom you should give tzedakah exclusively first. V'chein kulam kamadrei gazu. That's how he interprets this mechaber. A very interesting pshat in the mechaber. It's certainly not the pashup pshat. But he understands that if a person has, let's say, $10,000 of meiser money, so he should not give it all to his relative, even if his relative barely needs it. He should do it on a scale. Give a greater percentage to his relative. And if he has a brother and a cousin, give a greater percentage to a brother than to a cousin. And even if you have a brother and a cousin, and you're going to give significant amounts to both of them, give something to poor people that are not related, or in the context of the way it works in our culture. Give some to those mostos, like Tomchei Shabbos, like there's more fun that spread out money evenly among a whole bunch of people. Because those other people need to be taken care of also. And of course, then he has the other pshat. Even parnasaso, that your own parnasa comes first, can't be interpreted literally. Because at least Aruch HaShulchan, writing from his perspective, that'll be the case. No one will give meiser except for incredibly wealthy people. He says this, that we say your parnasa comes first. That's talking about your bare necessities comes first. Shlomo, if you could just hold off for 1 second. Your bare necessities comes first. But let's say you make parnasa, but only enough to feed your family nicely. To have meat on Shabbos is not a luxury in our culture. Chicken, for sure, is not a luxury. Who sits down to a Shabbos meal without chicken today? You might say you'd survive without chicken at your Shabbos meal, right? You'd survive if you never ate chicken during the week, or meat during the week, or even cheese during the week. You could eat macaroni for a long period of time. It's very cheap. Rice and beans, as they say. So he says that we say your parnasa comes first is only for the bare minimum. But after you have enough for that, give something for your relatives who are in a worse situation, for poor people who are in a worse situation. And even to poor people in another city. Again, because if the money is just limited to the precedence listed in Shulchan Aruch, what do you do with a poor person? There's poor people, poor Yidden who live in places where there's no kehillah. They also need to be funded. Okay? Look, there's no limit to what one considers one bare expenses, right? Today in the summer, we consider air conditioning to be, most of us consider a necessity. The reality is, you run an air conditioner in a house here, it costs several $100s. Is that really a necessity? I don't know. Okay? Maybe one has a person who needs it badly, and it's 97 degrees outside, that's a necessity, but it's not 97 degrees every day in this climate. So that's what he holds. He says this, that we say your parnasa comes first, so koi rak al misheshol rak lechem mitzumtzam, bare bread, lahachios nafsho, to sustain himself and his wife and his kids. But if you have that, then you should be separating out tzedakah more than a shlishus hashekel. You could think about this Aruch HaShulchan, it's quite fascinating, because do we say perhaps like in his time in Eastern Europe, so the taka were people that had just bread and water. I don't think we know anybody that has just bread and water. Even people that don't make any money, who just has bread and water today. I mean, it's very rare. So it could be, you could argue that even according to Aruch HaShulchan, what we consider today are bare necessities are more than just bread and water. Maybe. More than just bread and water. So to us, that's unfathomable. We wouldn't be able to contemplate a mishpacha where they're serving just bread every day. I mean, we just can't figure that out. Even just macaroni every day, we can't figure it out. And every tzedakah organization, if you said there's a family that's only eating bread, They pile money on the family today. Baruch Hashem. So it could be our bare necessities different, but it is important to take into account what he's saying. Well, we consider our necessities very often, even in our culture, our luxuries, and therefore a person is still chayav to give tzedaka. I wish everybody a wonderful rest of your Rosh Chodesh El. I look forward to learning with everybody the regular time on Erev Shabbos Kodesh.